Imagine waking up tomorrow and discovering that you own the network moving the products that America buys every single day. Thousands of trucks, hundreds of trailers, warehouses, distribution centers, drivers, dispatchers, fuel contracts, technology, and customers who expect one thing: their freight must arrive on time, every time. At first, it sounds like an incredible business because the money involved is enormous. In the United States alone, trucking generated roughly $900 billion in freight revenue in 2024.
$900 billion. But here's the strange part. Moving billions of dollars of freight does not necessarily make you rich. In fact, it can make you very poor. Because freight transportation has one of the most brutal economic problems in business. Your costs happen every mile. Your trucks depreciate every mile. Your drivers have to be paid every mile. Fuel is consumed every mile. But your customer doesn't necessarily pay you enough for every mile. And one empty truck can turn a profitable route into a loss. So, if you actually owned a massive freight transport network, would you be sitting on a money machine? Or a machine designed to slowly eat your fortune? Let's find out. Let's start with the obvious question. How much would it cost to enter this business? You could start small. One truck, one trailer, one driver, one route. But that's not a freight network. A network begins when individual pieces start working together. Truck A picks up freight in Chicago. Truck B moves it toward Dallas. Another vehicle takes it to a warehouse. Another delivers it to the customer. Now, you have something much more valuable: a system. And building that system requires capital. A serious national network could involve hundreds of millions of dollars in equipment, facilities, technology, and working capital. And the trucks are only the beginning. Because a truck sitting in a parking lot is not an asset producing money. It's an asset producing expenses. The real asset is utilization. How many hours does it move? How many miles does it run? How often does it carry paying freight? And perhaps most importantly, what happens after it reaches its destination?
Because this is where the economics becomes brutal. Imagine a truck arriving in Dallas. The delivery is complete. The trailer is empty. But your next customer is hundreds of miles away. The truck still exists. The driver still has to be paid. The insurance still runs. The equipment still depreciates. But there is no revenue. And suddenly, your billion-dollar network has a very expensive problem.
A freight network looks simple from the outside. A customer has something, you move it. But behind that simple transaction is an enormous coordination problem. Imagine Walmart needs a shipment moved from Texas to Pennsylvania. The freight has to be picked up. The driver needs to be available. The tractor needs to be available. The trailer needs to be available. The route has to be legal. The fuel has to be available. The customer needs a delivery appointment.
And then, the next load has to be found. All of this is happening while thousands of other shipments are moving through the same system. This is why a freight network is really a giant optimization machine. The goal isn't simply to move more freight. The goal is to move more freight with fewer empty miles, using fewer assets, while keeping customers happy and keeping costs below the price customers are willing to pay. That's much harder. Because the truck isn't necessarily the most important part of the business.
the information controlling the truck can be even more valuable.
Where is the freight? Where is the driver? Where is the trailer? Which customer needs capacity? Which route has higher rates? Where are trucks sitting empty? And where will the next profitable load come from? That information determines whether your network makes money or burns it. So, where does the money actually come from? The simplest answer is transportation. You charge a customer to move freight from point A to point B. But large networks can monetize much more than the actual movement. They can provide warehousing, cross-docking, dedicated transportation, intermodal services, freight brokerage, last-mile delivery, storage, specialized freight, and increasingly, data. This matters because freight is not one market, it's an ecosystem. A customer doesn't necessarily want to buy a truck, they want a problem solved. They want, take this from here and make sure it gets there. The company that can control the entire journey can capture more of the economics. And this is where scale becomes powerful. A large network can combine shipments, it can balance routes, it can share terminals, it can use the same technology across thousands of vehicles. It can negotiate fuel, it can negotiate equipment, and it can move freight between different transportation modes. Truck to rail, to truck to warehouse. J.B. Hunt's intermodal business is a good example. In the fourth quarter of 2025, its intermodal segment generated about $1.55 billion in revenue and roughly $135 million in operating income. The company specifically highlighted better network balance and fewer empty container movements as drivers of improved efficiency. That sounds like a tiny operational detail. It isn't. Because in freight, small inefficiencies multiplied across millions of miles become millions of dollars. And that's the hidden business. You're not really selling miles. You're selling efficient movement. Now comes the part that destroys the fantasy. The bill. According to A-Tree, the average cost of operating a truck reached about $2.33 per mile in 2025. And that's an average across the industry. Fuel is only one part. Then there are drivers, maintenance, insurance, tires, equipment, permits, technology, facilities, management, and financing. Now imagine your 1,000 truck network. If each truck travels roughly 100,000 miles per year, that's 100 million vehicle miles. 100 million. At $2.33 per mile, your theoretical operating cost approaches $233 million every year. And remember, that's before we even start talking about what happens when the market turns against you. Because freight rates aren't fixed. When demand is strong, customers compete for capacity. Rates rise. Trucks become more profitable. Then new capacity enters the market. More trucks, more drivers, more trailers, more competition. And rates fall. But your costs don't magically disappear. The truck payment remains, the insurance remains, the terminal remains, the employee remains. And that's how a freight boom can eventually create the conditions for a freight bust. Knight-Swift's 2025 results show just how thin the economics can become. The company generated approximately $7.5 billion in revenue, but only around $216 million in operating income. That's an operating margin of roughly 3%. 3
1%. A business can move billions and still have very little room for mistakes. And that creates the ultimate question. What happens when something goes seriously wrong?
The winners in freight usually understand one thing. Scale isn't enough. You need density. Imagine you operate 10 trucks. Truck number 1 finishes in Dallas, but your next customer is in Phoenix. Your truck has to travel hundreds of miles before it can make money again. Now imagine you operate 1,000 trucks. There may already be freight waiting in Dallas, and another truck may already be heading toward Phoenix. That's network density. The bigger the network becomes, the more opportunities you have to match supply with demand.
This is why the best operators obsess over utilization. Not simply how many trucks do we own, but how much revenue can every truck generate? How many miles are productive? How quickly can trailers turn? How many loads can we consolidate? How much freight can move through the same terminal? The winner doesn't necessarily own the most equipment. The winner gets the most economic output from each piece of equipment. And that distinction is enormous.
But freight has another lesson. Big doesn't mean safe. In 2023, Yellow Corporation, a trucking company that had been operating for almost a century, collapsed into bankruptcy. It had scale, it had terminals, it had customers, it had trucks. But years of financial problems, debt, operational difficulties, and labor conflict eventually became too much. And this is the terrifying part. In freight, once customers start leaving, the network can deteriorate very quickly.
Fewer shipments mean lower utilization. Lower utilization means higher cost per shipment. Higher costs force prices upward. Higher prices make customers leave. And suddenly, a network that used to reinforce itself starts destroying itself. This is the dark side of network economics. Scale creates an advantage until scale creates too much cost. And then, the same network that made you powerful can become the thing that kills you.
So, what can actually destroy a freight transport network? It's not necessarily one truck breaking down. It's not even necessarily fuel prices. The biggest threat is losing control of the network's balance. Demand changes, trade changes, fuel changes, labor changes, regulation changes, technology changes, and geopolitics can change everything. A port disruption can reroute freight. A trade policy can reduce imports. A war can force ships onto longer routes. A recession can reduce manufacturing.
And suddenly, the network you built for yesterday's economy is operating in tomorrow's world. Recent disruptions involving the Red Sea, the Panama Canal, and global trade policies have shown just how vulnerable freight networks can be. And this creates another uncomfortable truth. You don't actually control the economy. You only control your network. The economy controls the amount of freight that enters it. And that's why freight is ultimately a bet on economic activity. If factories produce, you move freight. If retailers sell, you move freight. If consumers buy, you move freight. If trade expands, you move freight. But if those things stop, your trucks don't suddenly stop costing money. They just stop earning it.
So, let's do the calculation. Imagine you buy a national freight network with roughly 1,000 trucks. Not a tiny carrier, not FedEx, not Amazon. A serious regional to national operation. Let's build a simplified model.
The acquisition cost could easily reach hundreds of millions of dollars, depending on the age of the fleet, the terminals, the contracts, the debt, and the quality of the network. Now assume the network generates approximately $350 million in annual revenue.
That's an illustrative model based on the economics of large trucking operators. Now comes the dangerous number. If the network operates around a 3% operating margin, annual operating profit is only about $10.5 million, $350 million in revenue. $10.5 million in operating profit. Suddenly, the billion-dollar freight empire doesn't look quite so magical. If you paid $300 million for the business and earned $10.5 million in operating profit, your simple operating payback would be almost 29 years.
29. And that's before taxes, before interest, before major expansion, before acquisitions, before a recession, before a catastrophic accident, before a major technology investment. Of course, this is not a forecast. It's a stress test. A real freight network can perform dramatically better or dramatically worse, depending on density, contracts, asset utilization, freight mix, pricing, fuel economics, and capital structure. But that's precisely the point. The business isn't about owning trucks. It's about controlling the variables. Because if you can push utilization higher, reduce empty miles, increase revenue per load, and move more freight through the same infrastructure, the economics can change dramatically.
And this is where technology becomes interesting. The next generation of freight companies may not win because they own more trucks. They may win because they know exactly where every truck should be before the truck even finishes its current delivery. Better forecasting, dynamic pricing, artificial intelligence, autonomous vehicles, smarter routing, better consolidation. These technologies attack the industry's biggest enemy: wasted capacity. Because in freight, efficiency isn't a side benefit. Efficiency is the product.
So, would I buy a freight transport network? Let's score it. Investment score, 4 out of 10. The capital requirement is enormous. You need equipment, facilities, technology, working capital, and enough cash to survive bad cycles. Risk score, 8 out of 10. Freight is exposed to the economy, fuel, labor, interest rates, trade, regulation, and demand.
Difficulty score, 10 out of 10. This might be the hardest part, because you're not managing one machine. You're managing a living network. Thousands of people, thousands of assets, millions of miles. Every day. Profit score, 6 out of 10. There is enormous revenue potential, but the margins can be painfully thin. The winners can make fortunes. The losers can lose everything. Overall score, 6 out of 10. I wouldn't buy a freight network simply because it's big.
I'd buy one because its network is dense, its customers are locked in, its assets are productive, its routes are balanced, and its technology gives it an advantage competitors can't easily copy. Because that's the secret. The real asset isn't the truck. It isn't the trailer. It isn't even the warehouse. It's the network. A system capable of taking something worth millions of dollars, moving it thousands of miles, and doing it again tomorrow without wasting the capacity you already paid for. And when you look at the world this way, you realize something.
Every product you buy, every package that arrives at your door, every supermarket shelf, every factory, every warehouse, depends on a machine most people never think about. A machine that moves billions of dollars every year. And the strangest part, the machine makes money only when almost everything goes right. One truck, one route, one shipment, one more mile. And then another. That's the economics of owning a freight transport network.